Okay, well, welcome. I'm here with Beverly Baker from the Metropolitan Finishing School. Beverly, I'm just super happy to have you here. Really excited for this conversation. Just as we kind of kick off, would you mind just kind of introducing yourself for those that don't know who you are?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. We've connected on Instagram and have had, I think, really conversations that I found very rewarding. So it's great to connect with you in person, as you will, via Zoom.
Yeah.
So my background and I think how we've wound up connecting is I have a business called Metropolitan Finishing School. It's a little bit tongue in cheek, that name. We are not a finishing school in terms of how to drink your tea with your pinky out, but it's more about how to navigate uh, dense city public spaces in a really powerful way. And I got my start in that in teaching traditional self defense, which I had gotten into via martial arts, had done that for about 10 years. I started martial arts back in the 80s in high school. And then about 10 years into that, started teaching what I call mainstream or traditional self defense, which is your basic, here's how you kick, here's how you punch, here's how to use your voice, that kind of thing. So I've been doing that for over 20 years. And then it was probably it was about 10 years ago, I moved to Los Angeles and I live in the heart of the Hollywood tourist district and love it. It's an electric, vibrant place, maybe not quite so vibrant lately with COVID. But I really started to see how a lot of things that I had been taught and then that I was then therefore passing on in kind of mainstream self-defense was really not quite, didn't quite fit the environment or the context I was in. It might be good, and like those tools might be good enough if nothing actually ever really happens. You don't have an encounter, and they're good. They're empowering. They make you, give you confidence and strength like that. But what I've really started to notice was, if a mentally unstable person on drugs is going to jump me, the last thing I want to do is get them in my guard and submit them or, kick them in the groin. Like I just don't even want to get that close. So my focus has shifted to a course. What I'm most known for is a course called Asphalt Anthropology, which
Mhm.
really focuses on, again, not the kicking and punching, but the just how do I get from A to B? And I tend to focus asphalt. I've taught from everybody from chambers of commerces to private companies to neighborhood groups. And then I still teach physical self-defense. And over the past year, I focused those efforts and working strictly with folks who are most likely to be targeted for hate crimes. So
Mhm.
asphalt is open for everybody. And then the physical stuff, which I'm actually not charging for because I just want to make people who are the most vulnerable. And we've seen a lot of that sadly in the last year of hate crimes going up. So working to equip those folks.
That's awesome. We had a podcast earlier with Citizen Operating Systems, and what I didn't realize is she does a lot of parkour and her stuff, and I didn't really know about the background of parkour, and it sounds very similar to asphalt anthropology in the sense that you focus on not so much the fighting but the flighting and kind of how do you get away, create distance, and be able to react to kind of an urban environment.
Right. Yeah.
Is that something that you incorporate in, or is that kind of something completely different?
No, I would definitely not compare what I do to parkour, which sounds awesome, and I have to meet her. She sounds really great. But no, this is more on the side of situational awareness. There is a whole aspect or a portion of asphalt where we talk about street dodges, but rather than these are things that people with any kind of physical abilities can do. So it's things like pawing corners, right? Like how do you go around a corner? Do you take it tight? Or do you take it wide to give yourself visibility?
Mm.
Playing games, things like if you walk up to, you're going to cross the traffic light or waiting for a traffic light, rather than standing there on the edge, waiting for the light to change, to kind of circle back, put your back to the wall, embrace your whole environment, see your whole environment. If you feel like someone is following you, how to circle back in an inconspicuous way and more or less take their back. And then there's also the distinction, I said, in an inconspicuous way. And then sometimes you have to elevate it and let people know, I see that I see what you're doing, kind of thing. So we talk through, those kinds of scenarios, and we practice those in the wild, if you will. And maybe for me, I think of parkour as being very physical and kind of climbing fences, bouncing off of things, which sounds awesome. I'm totally down for that. But this is definitely a bit more scaled back, so that people with a wide range of abilities, maybe you've got a bag full of groceries, or you've got, a child in tow. So it's really making this accessible to a lot of folks.
Well, and it sounds very practical. And I think that's where a lot of people, especially in the self-defense kind of area space, and when they're talking about situational awareness, and they're talking about, from what I've gathered from what you're saying, is you've identified the fact that that if you're situationally aware, you know where you're at in that person's attack cycle. And one of the things that I see very prominent, specifically on Instagram these days in particular, but also more generally, is that people assume that attack cycle is instantaneous, or that you just have to be able to react immediately. And from what it sounds like, what you're saying is you try to stay situationally aware, so that you can enact within that attack cycle, so you can decide what kind of measures to make before.
I hadn't really thought of it the way you just brought that up, in terms of it's like, but I think it's really spot on what you're saying, in terms of, I see something, I have to react right away. And the goal of the skills that I teach are to give people a heads up of this is how an opportunist or a predator will move, how they'll operate, how they'll groom you. And so, because a lot of times, here's the thing, here's where I'm kind of always railing against mainstream self-defense, is it's constantly telling you, look out for this and look out for that. And they love to show videos of people getting attacked. Whereas I kind of take a different approach, which is to trust that you are wired to be able, that your brain is is evolutionary wired to see threats. Now, what can get in the way are two things. One could be trauma. And so you're not able to process or act. And then the other part of that is, if you're just not familiar, like I have so many people who come, I'm based in LA, people who come from other cities, and it's just like such a foreign concept to them. And so when they see something happening, maybe their little bells go off, but they don't know what to do. They get in that frozen aspect, right? Sure. Not because of anything other than it's just unfamiliar to them. So yeah, I mean, what you said earlier, it's like, yes, if someone is closing in on you in a certain way, let's learn how to recognize it now. Like we can, watch it through video, we can workshop it and figure out like what your best options are, depending on your ability, depending on your age, depending on if you have kids with you. It might be your voice, it might be physically moving. It might be de-escalating, or just letting them know in other ways that you're a hard target.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to kind of hone in on, maybe you could talk a little bit more about, is the effect of trauma on individuals for their ability to act. And that's certainly one of the areas it's a pet peeve for me in self-defense, when people talk about, oh, if you're being a victim of domestic violence, you're just going to need to pull out a firearm and fire on that person, not understanding that person could be your husband or an uncle. Right. That there's an emotional connection there.
Right.
In your work because you work, or do you do some work with domestic violence?
I have been working, prior to COVID shutting everything down, for about 2 years. I'd been working at a mission on Skid Row, working with women with various types of trauma, including domestic violence, including drug addiction, including living on the streets. Prior to that, I had worked in other shelters, including, I lived in Austin, Texas for a while. And that was specifically for domestic violence survivors. I myself was attacked by an ex, and I can tell you, at the time, I had had decades of training under my belt. He was also a boxer. He's very good. And, I was able to protect myself. But would I have body slammed him to the ground and ripped his jugular out, like, what that fantasy is. No, because
Yeah.
as you said, there's like all this other stuff. So I was able to physically protect myself, but I'll tell you, that was the easy part, right? Like the hard part was the aftermath in terms of he was really unbalanced. He had had some bad experiences in Afghanistan and really went south. And so I had to take some further steps to protect myself. And that was actually, to me, the more scarier time than him coming at me with the fists flying and
Mm.
wanting to use me as a punching bag. So yeah, I mean, to your point, there's the physical stuff, and I'll always be a proponent of that, and I'll always share how valuable that is, and it's a piece of the larger puzzle. So if you're working with folks who either have experienced trauma, or maybe they haven't experienced trauma, but like you said, this could be someone, maybe it's they're getting groomed in this situation, this domestic violence situation, and it hasn't quite escalated to physical yet, to really give us the big T trauma. I'm sure there's like what they call little T trauma, happening every day. But it's most absolutely a bigger piece that you've got to address. And frankly, I'm in the middle of reading some papers now on rough and tumble play
Mm.
that was shared with me by a psychologist, and kind of how we develop that physical resilience, or that mental resilience, I should say, through physical training. So there's just so much value in the physical side of things, and it's not a silver bullet, if you will. There's a lot more to it.
Yeah, for sure. I think that it's always a lot more complex than your average YouTube video and Instagram post.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that the the cultural end of it, there's the racial component to it. Being a person from a marginalized community already kind of sets you at a huge psychological, emotional, sociological advantage than people I think really realize. And
Yeah.
certainly I see in many situations, not I should say all, but it's as far as the majority goes, that it's ironic that the self-defense industry caters to the white male of fighting age, and the marginalized, the people who actually need that defense training, don't get it because the marketing just doesn't go to them.
Yeah, and that's something I definitely have observed over the years. And I would go to group trainings and take a group photo, and then I would look at it and I'm like, wow, this is like the whitest bunch of suburbanites I've ever seen, like collected in one sitting. And I have friends of that demographic. It's not meant to be a slam, but
Right.
it's like, who's actually going to be the most targeted. And that's why I'd been noticing that. And then the events of the last year, I'm even though I had noticed it, I will share with you, my heart was actually broken in many ways to see how traditional self-defense didn't give a shit, I'll just say it,
Yeah.
with things that were happening with Black folks, and understanding that this is systemic, the violence. Like, this is not your fantasy of good guy with a gun, and just and there's a lot of, I think, unconscious, I'm going to say it's unconscious and give everyone the benefit of the doubt, but there's definitely a lot of systemic racism within the self-defense community, in that you were saying it's a lot of young white guys in this demographic, but it's also geared a lot towards maintaining the purity, if you will, of the fragile white woman, who kind of has this place in a pedestal in the home. And frankly, except for domestic violence, except for her threats are in the home, right? Someone like
Mhm.
that, the majority of their threats are in the home. And that's not really, there's not a one for one going on there that I see in the self-defense community. And for those who are doing it, I'm sorry for not acknowledging you. I'm talking about like the super mainstream, those marquee names, the ones that we all see out there. It's just, it's more of maintaining the status quo. and making people feel good and empowered without really addressing the systemic causes of violence.
Yeah, and it was an interesting summer. You saw a lot of people's true colors and
Yeah.
allegiance come through. We had Conquest of Thread as a kind of a small Missouri-based fabric shop that they responded to the needs of individuals needing plate carriers at protests because of obviously the right having firearms, and so they started making these plate carriers, and they were talking about how there were so many, if you just wanted equipment or within the firearm community, like people were making very public stances, political stances, and and then you had also on the self-defense side, and ironically the people who teach first aid and other stop the bleed classes, things like that, where they're doing that without masks on.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like there's trying to cite like white papers on the effectiveness of tourniquets and being kind of a leader in the medical community, but then they're teaching a class without self-distancing, not encouraging mask wearing. It's like, what is going on here? Like, and this is the community, this is.
Yeah, a couple of things. One, I feel like those communities generally are conservative in general, which I think makes sense, right? Because they're about preservation. They're about, how do you stay safe? You stay still. You're not progressive. Just kind of in the just the semantics of that word. And I've trained with a lot of those folks and appreciate what I was able to learn from them. But in the events of the last year or so, what you're saying, it with okay, I'm going to teach you how to use a tourniquet, but I'm not going to wear a mask. It's like, honestly, I'm to the point where if that is your lack of critical thinking and judgment, I really begin to question everything about you. Maybe that's not fair on my part, but it really does make me question a lot more about you than just meets the eye. It raises a lot of questions.
Yeah, I mean, it for me, it makes it very hard because I have a hard time. They say that the experts, of course, are saying, well, we have to approach talking with these individuals with compassion and understanding. And it's so hard because you don't get that in response. So it's a very hard position for people to be in. You can't suggest someone to wear a mask because there was, over the course of the summer, I think within 2.5 months, there were 9 instances where people were murdered because they asked someone to wear a mask going into a supermarket or a store.
Right.
Like it was that's insane. Like,
yeah.
So just by asking somebody to be conscious of your own health can put your life in jeopardy.
Right. And for me, kind of the asphalt anthropology approach to that is just like how to avoid those people and get the fuck out, right? Like, because what's the greater risk, the virus or them losing their minds? Because they've clearly demonstrated. I love that they're not wearing a giant symbol on their face to show that they don't care about me or anyone else. So that is like a huge red flag. Like now I know a ton of information about them.
Sure.
And so I have that luxury of just like reading that symbol or lack of symbol and avoiding and getting out. What really broke my heart is, every time these, places would reopen and the cities would reopen or the state, but then the company like Target or a grocery store would say, no, you still need to wear masks. Well, unfortunately, that puts a grocery worker or a grocery manager on the front line, which is just unconscionable that they would be put in that position, particularly without any training, but just put in that position in general. That's just insane.
Yeah,
I feel pretty strongly about that.
No, it goes to show. I mean, it used to be that the laborer was honored in this country, that we would honor the hard work that people did, whether they were stocking shelves or working in a factory or pumping gas or whatever, that everybody had a place in this world, this cultural divide has really shown. I don't know how that not to get too political on this, but to to the evils of this capitalist society that people are going to make this choice.
Yeah.
I'm going to sell wizards over protecting my human resources.
Right.
Yeah. So I guess when if you were a person listening to this and you were interested, or you were thought about going in and looking at a self-defense program or getting involved with a local group, what advice would you give?
Great question. So, there are certainly constraints for people given where they live and how much time and money they have. And so when I answer this question, I try to be mindful of that, right? Like maybe the best and closest thing to you is, this school over here that I might not otherwise recommend, but it's a great place to start, right? Like maybe if that's all it does is it gets you started and gets you to be educated, that's cool. But kind of, so I guess my first answer is just start, right? Like don't overthink it on one hand. And then kind of and now let's overthink it. So if we're going to think about it a little bit more is, really understand, find out that person's background, find out what they're, who taught them, where they're coming from. Also understand that if they look different than you, if they, are a different race, or if they are a different gender, or have, a different sexual orientation, understand that they may not be able to address. Let me just speak more plainly. If you are a Black gay person, a white male cop who's teaching self-defense can have stuff to teach you, but understand that, you have a very unique victim profile. So sure, go learn from them what you can, but also understand, and I think a lot of people who are in marginalized communities already do already, but I just want to, really underscore this for folks that, there's a lot of wisdom out there that may not look like the mainstream self-defense that we know. So really seek that out. I mean, if you're on social media, maybe you're in a community where you have lots of resources, or maybe you're in a community where you don't have a lot of, access to people. Either way, you can find on social media different voices to talk to, kind of get different perspectives. If you're looking particularly just for physical self-defense, go work with, if you can have the luxury of testing out different places, seeing who's a good fit, seeing who respects you, who listens to you. I've had really fantastic instructors, both male and female. And then I've had, people who just think they have a cookie cutter approach to self-defense, and yet they have very little experience themselves. So I guess what I'm trying to say is just get started, but as you get into it, become discerning about who's teaching you. What is their demographics? How does that apply to you? Do they really have the experience that you will need? Because again, I'm just going to pick on cops here for a minute, because somehow they and military, they're a dominant voice in this environment and self-defense, but their day-to-day is actually very different than mine. So if they're trying to teach me how to arrest someone, I'll go to them. But if I just want to get to the grocery store without getting accosted on the train, shoot, I've learned more from my own students in asphalt anthropology than I've learned from any quote unquote expert. So I'm kind of rambling here.
No.
I'm so sorry about that Friday afternoon ramble. But I guess kind of just to summarize that is kind of challenge your own perceptions of what a self-defense instructor looks like, what their background might be. We can learn something from everyone. I'm not trying to dismiss any group, but because we can learn something from everyone, talk to other mothers who have to navigate, using a stroller, talk to other people who work in urban environments. And on the flip side, I come up with a saying recently is I don't take street smart self-defense advice from anyone whose primary experience is the suburbs. Like,
yeah,
it's just like not even valid in my book. So really just use your critical thinking. And have some fun. Again, with at risk of everything I'm saying in terms of overthinking it, this can be fun. If you do have trauma in your background, it may be less fun. So you'll definitely want to connect with someone who has a trauma-informed approach. There is no standard as to what that means, but you can tell in a couple of conversations if they are at least on board. And if it comes down to it, reach out to me, and I can recommend maybe some people in your area.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Yeah, that's great. I think everyone's has a story of, I call them the gun shop horror stories. If you walk into a gun store and either the proprietor or the guy behind the counter is completely racist, or you just
Yeah.
see I just see blatantly they'll have, especially in the Obama era, you saw a lot of just racist cartoons and kind of political leanings. That was an easy way to know where you're going to shop, and you could just turn around right away. But you want to join a karate class, you don't know until you've gotten in a few classes sometimes.
Yeah.
But
yeah. And again, I'm always mindful of, like, a lot of people I talk to, because I do long distance stuff. It's like they may not have access, right? There may be only one taekwondo place in their entire town, and I wouldn't necessarily start recommending taekwondo for self-defense, but it's a start, right? So I would rather encourage people to get started than rather work on perfection. And then, like, to your point, you kind of find these things out over time. And so that's another approach as well.
How much of it do you feel is just confidence? Whether you're study karate or jiu-jitsu or taekwondo or asphalt anthropology, how much of it is just being confident that you can handle a situation that you're in?
Oh, that's a really great question. I think that is all of it, to be honest with you. And I think confidence comes from, having experiences and skills. I know that there's been times I've been confident where I probably shouldn't have been, and that saved my bacon a little bit. I have stories to tell on, being followed by men on the street, things like that. And the way I handled it was probably pretty cocky, but it worked, right? So, confidence really goes a long way. And also keep in mind, like, the kind of creepy flip side of that is it's not a cure-all, right? Like, there could be some sexist, gross person out there who's like, oh, I want to take her down a peg. She looks a little too confident. I'm not saying that we should disown being confident in favor of that. I just kind of want to have you consider the bigger picture there.
Sure, that can be a trigger point for somebody to for sure. Well, so you've alluded to, you talked to this twice, as experience, and having the right experience, both from the instructor's point of view. What kind of experiences would you look for in a good instructor? And kind of with that, you've kind of alluded to a few experiences, or you've mentioned a few experiences that you've had. Can we tease out experience a little bit more and talk a little bit more about that? And
yeah, I guess really my question, though, back to you is, experience in what, right? Like, there's people who, like I was saying earlier, I don't take self-defense advice from people in the suburbs, but maybe there's somebody in the suburbs who's, like, really brilliant and understands the dynamic of domestic violence and can be a great resource there, right?
Yeah.
Or, understands victim grooming, who understands, like, the whole dark web. Like, those are not my areas of expertise. And so I guess really understand for yourself that, Beverly, my niche is being street smart. And, that does not translate into me knowing, and even though I experienced domestic violence, that doesn't make me an expert in domestic violence. So when, to be a better consumer of this, if you will, understand what that person's relevant expertise is, and know what you're looking for. So if you are looking for, maybe you've got kids and you want to keep them safe and you're worried about them, going off and, joining a little league, then you should be understanding, like, how, adults in those positions groom for, predatory, for abuse, I should say.
Right.
So that's my answer back to you is like, know what you're looking for and find someone who's specific in that. Do you want me to dive in more deeply on anything, or it's kind of general there?
No, I just think, yeah, I mean, I think that's the kind of the key point. People say you need to have experience, but then that's such a broad term. It
Yeah.
really doesn't mean anything until
Yeah.
you really kind of figure out what is it that you mean. And
Yeah.
so I remember having a conversation with a gentleman who's he's a deputy sheriff, former Army Ranger, and we were talking about self-defense, and I said, well, you learn self-defense on a battlefield with rules of engagement in a different country. What we're talking about here is self-defense amongst your community, amongst your neighbors,
Right.
people that you live with every day. That's a very different situation. And
Right.
I was trying to get him to see how we can, how you can make that connect. And he was a sheriff, so I mean, he understood what I was talking about. But it was an interesting experience, because I think, or a conversation, because I think a lot of people do talk about experience, and some people have taken a life with a firearm, for example, but was the context appropriate, or the same, or many people that teach martial arts have never been in a physical contact with anybody.
Right.
It happens.
Yeah. I mean, here's an example of that. I enjoy Krav Maga. I've been to 4 different schools, just because of moving and going to like graduate school and things like that. I just kind of bopped around for a period. And the first 2 I went to were fantastic, like just great instructors, great curriculum, great drills, a lot of fun, sensitive to trauma, and just fantastic. And then the last 2 I went to were like terrible. And the last class I ever did at this one school, which I had already been like, I'm not enjoying it. And one reason that I was like really about it was because I knew that I was practicing bad habits. And I was like, I really have to stop going, but it was like the only thing available at the time, blah, blah, blah. But the last time I went I was in a class with a guy who had a black belt, and he was teaching the class, and we were practicing bear hugs. And so I was working with my partner, and well, first the instructor showed, okay, here's bear hug. Here's how your partner is going to grab you, and here's what you do. Okay, great. It's pretty basic, not a big deal. So my partner grabbed me in a way that was different, right? I can't remember. It was like real low or something like that. Like he came in low, and his like face was more like my belly, and he would grab me more low. And so I didn't do the cookie cutter response that the instructor gave me. And he came over and literally scolded me and was like, no, that's not right. This is what we're supposed to be doing. And I was just like floored. And I didn't want to make a thing about it at the time, because I just knew I was never going to come back. Right.
Mhm.
But unfortunately, this guy is still out there teaching, and teaching people that you can defend yourself wrong. And, because I didn't follow his cookie cutter prescription, I was therefore wrong, even though that prescription wouldn't have worked for the scenario I wound up in. So in terms of like, let's talk about experience. Okay. He's earned a black belt in Krav Maga. And I know this school takes a lot of pride in, the grind of the class it puts you through. But he actually, from what I could gather, he'd never been attacked. He had never been in any real physical threat. He's not a woman. And it was good enough for me to go to for a while. And then it just wasn't good enough, because I was just like, yeah, I'm not going to ingrain bad habits in myself.
Hi, listeners. I want to take a quick break from our podcast to remind you that the Desk to Defender project relies on contributions and donations made by our listeners and supporters. We hope that you are learning a lot about building solidarity and defending your communities through our discussion. If you are enjoying this podcast, we ask you please to consider subscribing and visiting our website. For any of you with means, please also consider becoming a patron through our Patreon account. Thank you, and enjoy this podcast.
Yeah. Well, if you were, if you were to, or maybe you are starting something for the future, a future program or something that you dream about or implementing, what would that be?
Oh, that's a really fun question. So something I do and have been doing, this was pre-COVID, something I did in a small way was leading groups through public spaces
Mm.
and just playing games with it. It could be people watching bingo. And then you have to have done asphalt anthropology to do this portion. And so we look for the things that we learn in class, things like that. So I've been doing those in just kind of small ways prior to COVID. And they're just so much fun. And my husband's in the tourism business here in Los Angeles. And so, we've talked about, and I've talked to other people in the tourism industry, it'd be kind of fun to kind of combine that somehow, like make it a, what do you call it? A scavenger hunt meets, asphalt anthropology. Because really my goal is to have people own the street in a very confident way. And I don't mean own it like I own it and you don't, but to really take back a lot of, reclaim. There's so much fear propagated out there about cities. There's so much fear propagated about, people doing certain activities, and, be mindful, and here's some skills how to do it. So to answer your question, I would love to do something like that on a larger scale and just have a lot of fun with it, really.
Yeah, that sounds great. That sounds like a lot of fun, and it's a perfect fit because, as you know, lots of tourists are marked as as tourists, and they get the brunt of the pickpocketing and the attacks and the all that fun stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So you have done some clinic work as a kind of a quasi bodyguard, is that right?
Oh, yeah. So I have, and this was again pre-COVID. The group I volunteer with has shifted because of COVID. But prior to that, I'd spent a number of years as a volunteer escort clinic at a healthcare clinic that provides abortion services. And boy, did that teach me a lot.
I bet.
And so, the clinic was set up in such a way that, and again, here in the United States, abortions are technically legal. But there's a lot of obstacles to actually obtaining them, and those obstacles really depend on what state you're in. And even in California, they can be challenging, right? Because, if you live in Central Valley, which is a lot of, clinics are more in, like, say, LA or San Francisco, but if you live in a more remote area, you've got to, jump through hoops. And then the last hoop you have to jump through is walking up to the clinic doors itself while people scream at you, call you a murderer, harass you, bully you, physically intimidate you. And so I started with a group here in LA called LA for Choice, and we are just a very non-engaged. We don't engage with the harassers, but we have tactics that we, make it much more smooth for the patients to go in, to get abortions, to get any kind of health care that they happen to be seeking that day.
Yeah, it's I'm a little lost of words, but I had, when you think of the protests or the demonstrations or the prayers that are happening in front of clinics, I think, or at least for me, the thing that you think of are the people who are kind of quietly praying, or they're on their knees maybe, or they're doing a prayer circle. At least that's part of the propaganda that the churches send out into their parishioners and their members. But it can be quite an ugly thing when you're at ground zero.
Oh yeah, I mean, literally, I have goosebumps just with memories right now. I mean, yes, there are those folks who sit quietly and pray, and then there are the other folks who are much more vocal, much more physically aggressive, and maybe they're not putting that on their propaganda, but they do have tactics, right? Like I don't know what goes on in those meetings, but they learn from each other, and there's all kinds of tactics to push. And I wrote about this in my blog, and I can share the link with you, but I'll just never forget. This was early of me being an escort. And there was a young woman who, the clinic hadn't opened yet. It was like, we opened at, I don't know, like 8, and it was like 10 minutes to 8. And she walked through the gauntlet. We got her through the gauntlet, and the doors were still locked. And we encouraged her, like, if she wanted to go to the back where she wouldn't be as exposed, but she was actually kind of out of it.
Mm.
And she starts telling me how she had a miscarriage the night before, and she went to the emergency room, and they did whatever they did for her, and then they told her to come here to the clinic the next day with, some paperwork. And she was in shock. I mean, I can't clinically diagnose that, but she was just the most fragile person. And she just starts telling me, like, her story, and I was just so moved, and just like, there's this, I didn't ask anything. It's none of my business, but I was there to support her. And then at the back, 10 feet from us, on the other side of a low wall, were people screaming at her that she was a murderer. And it was one of the most surreal moments of my life, because literally the front of my body was full of love and compassion, and the back of my body was full of, like, rage and just wanted to destroy.
Mm.
And it was just like, literally, my body at that moment, I had two things going on. And thank God the doors finally open, and she went in and was able to get the health care she needed. But yeah, I remember turning around and just looking at them and just being stunned, and just, I went in the back and cried. It takes its toll. And I didn't cry for me. I cried for that woman and what she had to hear. And I kind of comfort myself to think, well, maybe she didn't hear it because she was so out of it. I don't know that that's true, but it's a little lie I tell myself.
Yeah, well, sometimes we need those lies to get through the day.
Yeah.
The world can be a beautiful place and a very ugly place at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what other programs at Metropolitan Finishing School do you work on?
So yeah, again, the kind of the class I'm known for is Asphalt Anthropology,
Mhm.
and that's pretty much like the branding I kind of use to talk about it in a big way, because it just really resonates for people. And then I really kind of morph that particular core class based on what people's needs are. So if I'm teaching it for a chamber of commerce and for a bunch of store owners, it looks like one thing. If I'm teaching it to, like, a neighborhood community who's experiencing, certain situations, maybe with break-ins, that kind of thing, we talk. It'll change. So asphalt is like a core class that will change. And then there's sidewalk sociology, which is the smaller class that I do in small groups that we talked about. I want to expand and do kind of more like fun stuff with.
Yeah.
And then the physical stuff. Again, I'm just working solely with people for that who feel they may be targeted for a hate crime. And so those are the 3 areas I'm focused on.
That's awesome. You do a lot of great work, and you put out a lot of great content and great information for people. And I really had it was a breath of fresh air kind of finding you on social media, and being able
The feeling's mutual. I just want you to know that.
Yeah.
I really enjoy your stuff. And
Thank you.
good to have an ally, because yeah, I feel like we talked about this already. It tends to run a little conservative. And so
Yeah.
even when I went, like, trying to, like, to different trainings to seek training specifically for the clinic, I kind of felt like I had to keep that a secret, right? So yeah, no, I really appreciate connecting with you.
Yeah, this is great. I really would hope that people listening here will be able to find you, and I'm curious on where would you direct them to find, where's the best place, or where are you on social media and your website? And
Yeah, so I am active on Instagram at asphalt_anthropology. I post there pretty regularly. And then if you want to sign up for my newsletter, I have a newsletter that I publish once a month with resources and an article that reflects experiences that I've had that week in the city, or that month rather. And you can sign up for that at metrofinishschool.com. And that my website's there with more information about me and my classes. And yeah, but sign up for the newsletter, because That's the best way to stay in touch. We don't have to rely on algorithms.
Yeah, no, and it's a great newsletter for those that are listening. It is very good. Well, I really appreciate the time that you had with me here, and I really wish the best for you. And I think we're going to have a lot of great conversations in the near future. Maybe we'll have you come back on.
Yeah, I would love that. This has been great. Thanks for having me.
Awesome.
Thank you for listening to this podcast of Desk to Defender. If you'd like more, please give us a follow and share this podcast with your friends and comrades. We'll be back soon with another episode of Desk to Defender.